This week, a review of IDW's Best of EC Stories Artisan Edition, a new collection of original art by Wally Wood, Harvey Kurtzman, Al Williamson, Jack Davis, and Graham Ingels. Is EC's science fiction work inferior to the publisher's other genres? How do the 1950s social justice stories read today? Kumar and Dana discuss. First, if you appreciate the work we do on deconstructing comics and our other podcasts and want bonus content, we'd love it if you'd support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. Our monthly issue-by-issue look at 1960s Amazing Spider-Man comics is available to patrons chipping in at least $4 a month. Coming soon, we discuss the first John Romita issue. Check out our goals and rewards and pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics.
This is Kumar.
This is Dana.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Kumar in Melbourne. Dana's in Fredericton in Eastern Canada. It is Halloween morning here in Melbourne.
Yeah.
And appropriately, we're talking about the Best of EC Stories Artisan Edition from IDW. Now, this is your choice. And surprisingly, you might surprise some people. One or two people might be surprised. And so I didn't even know this was coming out. And that's kind of not a surprise because the EC Comics reprints are all over the map. They're from all different publishers. There's some from IDW. There's some from Fantagraphics. There's some from Dark Horse. This one is not even on IDW's own website.
Interesting.
For it, because I was trying to find some more info about it, and it wasn't even on there. There's like a Ray Bradbury collection coming out, or just came out. And when you emailed me and said, hey, you want to do this EC Comics book that's coming out, I was like, oh, it's going to be the Ray Bradbury one. And then it was this one. So what this is it's so IDW puts out these artist editions, which are these books that are like the size of your torso, that reprint the original art at the size they were drawn, maybe even a little bit larger, I guess, in some cases.
Wow.
And
what are those drawn on? Those are like 18 by 24 or something?
Something crazy, yeah, like that. And they're big hardcovers. They're like $250 US or whatever.
Yeah, okay.
Usually, very difficult. But every once in a while, IDW will put out one of these artisan editions, which is like a paperback in a smaller dimensions, larger than regular comic book, but not the size of your chest.
And it's kind of the same idea that it is like original artwork. It's not colored, but it is full color, high quality scans of original artwork with some markup and whiteout and stuff.
Yeah, there's also some of them. People have written some little grocery list type notes in the corners of some of these. Like I noticed one or two really odd notes, like somebody had written down a song or something.
Okay, I didn't really notice any weird ones. I think mostly it's just like a page, like there'll be page numbers. I think they write in the date and the issue and the title that it'll be published in. Yeah,
there's all sorts of weird notations, like editorial notations that I can't make heads or tails of. Some of them look like they've been a bit stained, like somebody spilled coffee on them or something at some stage. Yeah. There are a lot are yellowed,
Yeah, I was going to say some of it could be like glues or something.
Yeah.
If artists were kind of cutting up and moving things, stuff like that. Anyway, the point is it's kind of a neat book. It's not just a typical kind of reprinting of a published sort of version.
Yeah, no, and the Fantagraphics versions are black and white reprints, and the Dark Horse versions are color reprints. And they put out one called Choke Gasp, which was like 600 pages, like best of, which I got that one just like maybe a year or two back, and that's pretty great too. But they've been recolored, so they claim that they've tried to stick as closely as possible to Mary Severin's original colors, but The way the comic industry works now, that's almost always a lie. Like they stick close to the original colors, but the papers, they're printing on glossy paper, not the newsprint that absorbs and kind of subdues the colors. So they're like these really kind of glary, bright colors that they aren't supposed to be, which apparently is what current day comic readers like. They don't like the subdued. They don't like the colors to look the way they looked. Actually, they want the very poppy primary colors to jump out at them. Anyway, yeah. So, and also Mad Magazine, which is I think finally dead now, but it was being published kind of by DC. It's owned by DC, so I don't know why all these other EC books are coming out from all these other people. They used to come out from this company called Gemstone or Gladstone. This guy Russ Cochran was publishing them in the 90s. I had a bunch of those. And the other thing I wanted to say before we really get into it is, there was a Wally Wood one which came out, which I have as well. And that's really a pretty great Artisan edition that IDW put out maybe a couple of years back as well.
Right.
I think there were. So my understanding of this is there were. I think, and again, I couldn't find out much information about it because even IDW doesn't have it on their website. I think they did 2 artist editions of EC stories. And I think this is kind of a best of. They've called like half the stories from those 2.
Okay.
Put in here. And that's kind of what I'm guessing from like looking at some YouTube videos and stuff. I can't find any hard information about this really pretty amazing book. But the thing I wanted to say is I don't really care that much about original art. Because for me, part of the appeal of comics is it's like every page is like something. You can go to an art gallery and look at a painting, or you could look at a page of comic art, and you get 30 pages of comic art for like a couple of bucks, which if the art is great, is a really great, awesome thing. And I don't really understand the appeal of original art, especially modern, like from more modern comics. But I'm surprised that this art has survived.
Yeah.
So if you know anything about like at Marvel, kids would come and visit the offices, and they would chop up the art into panels and hand out a panel to each kid.
Yeah.
And also they refused to give the art back to the artist. It was like, this is our property. So there's very little, like all that Jack Kirby stuff from Marvel from the 60s is gone. Somehow, a whole pile of these EC stories have survived from the 50s. I don't know how they did it. But I will say that there's a Lone Wolf and Cub Artisan edition. I own that because I thought, okay, Japanese art especially tends to just vanish. I think there's, for some tax reason, it's like the artists, they have to pay taxes if they own these assets of the original art or something, so they have to they try to get rid of it or throw it out.
Yeah.
But for these ones, I think at the time, EC Comics, as much as I love them and have read all those editions, the printing process obliterated a lot of the detail in the art. And we'll talk about all that stuff and all the feathering and the inking and the cross-hatching and all the lush detail was kind of lost in the coloring and the poor printing process. And it's only through these original art stories, which we're lucky to have, that we can really see how awesome those artists were. And we knew they were awesome already.
Yeah.
They were awesome despite the obliteration. And now we're looking at it again. Yeah. It's like, oh my God, this is like at a level I wasn't even thinking about before.
So that's the thing that struck me, because part of the reason I picked this book, because I had some inclination, or I had some feeling that you obviously you didn't grow up in the 50s, so you weren't like reading first run EC or whatever. But I mean, just you being you, I knew that you had these things. You were into these things. You had read a lot of these things. But I don't really remember, like when we were going through university and stuff, and I kind of went through most of your collection. Like you would bring over not garbage bags, grocery bags filled with like Swamp Thing or Sandman or whatever, just all the stuff like Alan Moore, and I would just read it. I don't recall any, or very much. I don't recall any EC. So anyway, I'm aware of EC because historically, obviously, it's incredibly significant in American comics, but I've never really been a reader.
Right.
So, yeah, I picked this because I thought, well, that might be kind of an interesting couple of perspectives, contrasting perspectives from, one guy's got a bit of background with this material, somebody else who's never really seen it before and is seeing it for the first time in this, in a way, kind of this is the inauthentic way to experience it the first time.
In a sense.
Nobody in the 50s saw anything to this level of quality.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you say, you knew they were great, even despite the quality of printing and not that the coloring was poor, but just that it obscured some of the work of the line work. But yeah, kind of mind blowing how much art, how many lines, how much work are on these pages.
Yeah. There's right off the bat. So it starts with Touch and Go, which is a story drawn by Johnny Craig based on a Ray Bradbury story about this guy who's murdered another man in his mansion and becomes obsessed with wiping his fingerprints off of everything and can't remember what he's done or not done. And on the third page, there's this panel of him looking down at a bowl of fruit on a table with the tablecloth on it. Yeah. And I'm looking at the lines on the tablecloth. Now, he probably would have used some sort of tone to he would have used he wouldn't have drawn those lines. He would use some sort of tone to put them on the tablecloth, but a zipatone of some sort. But he's gotten the angle perfectly right, especially as it falls over the edge of the table, and just he's chosen this angle it's a really interesting overhead angle of this guy looking down at the table, and he's got all this fine detailing on this antique table, and it's really I just couldn't believe it.
Pretty astounding.
And there's almost something in almost every story there was usually at least one panel that I was like, I can't believe that they went to this trouble. And they must have known at a certain point, a couple of years into the process, they were like, yeah, the color's never going to pick this up. But they were doing it anyway. They were still doing it. All right, so
this story, just real quickly as a side note, this story was a really strong start for me because it reminded me of a wonderful scene in the film The House That Jack Built, directed by
Lars von Trier.
That's right? The guy. Yeah,
haven't seen it. Okay.
Yeah. Not a general recommendation if you're sensitive to violence or anything. I don't think you should rush out and watch it with the family or anything. But if you're into horror and crime and have a strong stomach, there is a beautiful scene that is basically this story.
Right. Okay.
In that movie. And you kind of wonder, after I read this, I was like, I wonder, if the script writers of that movie had encountered this. I mean, not that it's, it wouldn't be a hard idea to come up with, if you've got a fastidious or obsessive.
Yeah, I guess it even goes back to Macbeth a little bit.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But anyway, that was just a neat little side note.
So, so we should talk about some of the artists that are represented in this book. So Johnny Craig, all the names you love. Johnny Craig, Reed Crandall, who I never, for me, he was in the bottom of the top 10 of the EC guys. We've got Jack Davis, Graham Ingels, Roy Krenkel, whose name I hardly know, Bernie Krigstein, we'll talk about quite a bit, Harvey Kurtzman, Joe Orlando, also is not a guy that I think about much, but he was part of the stable, but the thing I most associate with him is he was the guy that drew the pirate comic in Watchmen, according to the story of Watchmen. Joe
okay, yeah, interesting.
Alex Toth, there's one Alex Toth which is always reprinted. I think maybe it's the only. I don't know how much work he did for EC. Al Williamson is a big name. Wally Wood is a huge name. So it's basically alphabetical. We're missing a few people who are not here. John Severin, who I really love, And I think one of his stories was in one of the big artifact editions, and I'm a bit disappointed they didn't include it. Jack Kamen, who he's a guy who had a style that as soon as you look at the first panel, you can tell it's going to be a story about marital infidelity of some sort. Like, for some reason, the way he draws people's faces, it's really like, okay, these people are going to be cruel human beings.
That guy looks suspicious.
Yeah. Yeah, that man and that woman look very suspicious. They're up to something. Yeah. There's no Al Feldstein work, who is one of the weirder. I mean, he wrote almost all the EC, or half the EC stories. He drew a bunch of them. He had a kind of odd art style with these kind of weird elongated faces.
Okay.
And I think there were a couple of Frank Frazettas. I'm guessing that maybe nobody has the art for those. I will say another odd thing about this book is, although it says nothing inside, when I was ordering it on every website, I was going to various websites, where can I get this book? It said it was by Kevin Eastman. And I thought, and then I went on in the book, and Kevin Eastman's name is nowhere in it that I could find. But I wonder if he's the guy that actually owns all of this art.
Oh, yeah, right.
Because he would have the money and the interest to be able to own all these pages. And maybe that's why his name was associated with it at some stage, or I don't know. Maybe it was just a mistake of some weird sort. Okay, but so how do we want to approach this? Were there any stories or artists that you jumped out at you that you wanted to talk about as a first time exposed to this? I will say that in the 90s, I wasn't really reading these. So what happened was, in the 80s, I was buying gold key horror comics from that used bookstore in Fredericton that used to sell comics. United, maybe it was called United Bookstores. They used to sell cheapo comics, and I would somehow find these gold key, Twilight Zone comics, and they were really watered down kids comics, which I didn't know at the time. But I was a kid, and I was reading them. I was like, oh, I'm into these really short 8-page horror stories. And then later in the 90s, I learned about the EC comics, but they were, at the time, I think they were only coming out in black and white reprints, and it wasn't until the 90s, and they were hardcovers, library bound. It was weird. And then it wasn't until the early 2000s I really started hoarding as many of the color Russ Cochran reprints as I could. But, okay, first time in, is there any stories or artists you want to pick out?
No, not particularly. I know that we're probably gonna talk about Master Race, obviously.
So
and that's probably one of the handful that really stand out.
Yeah. In
terms of not that the writing in Master, it's interesting because the writing is sort of pooped on in that article that you sent me.
Yeah.
But writing in the sense that the story itself is actually it's not different from all the rest, because it does follow that pattern of here's a thing, and there's a twist, and wasn't that shocking?
Yeah.
And so in that sense, this stuff from the 50s kind of doesn't hold up necessarily unless you're sort of appreciating it with that historical lens. I think you have to go back and say, all right, this was pulp. It was being produced and published for entertainment for probably teenagers, and it was a different time. And this pattern, they were churning this stuff out, right? It wasn't they were spending a year in love with this story. None of these were works of love or passion projects or whatever, right? They were jobs, and they're putting this stuff out. So I think coming to it, as somebody who, I don't know, I enjoy. I don't know. I'm just looking at my calendar, my shelves. I enjoyed Watchmen. I mean, Black Hole, some Charles. I like books that are kind of independent, people that write stuff about things that they care about. So yeah, this kind of content, it's interesting. The first few were oh, that's cool. And then by the third one, you're oh, these are kind of all the same structure, in terms of structure.
Right.
So yeah, I mean that's just some initial impressions in terms of the stories.
I'm going to agree and disagree. I think the artists put a lot of passion into them. If not the writing, but you can see, especially in the original art, you can see how much care and attention went into it. And I also think...
Absolutely. I would agree with that.
I think although this... And especially with Master Race, because Bernie Krigstein was like... So they gave him a 5-page story, and they're like, no, I need 12 pages. And they came to a compromise, and they were like... He saw the potential of the story. He liked the story. He thought it was a powerful story, but he needed the space for it to breathe. And they're like, okay, the compromise was 8 pages.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting things about Master Race in particular, in terms of the writing, is because they said, no, it's got to be 5 pages. And he's like, and they finally went to 8. He said, I'll reorder the dialogue. And you can actually see on the original art where he has cut the sentences apart and pasted them back together, which is, we never really knew. We always heard the story that he had done that he had expanded the story and he had rearranged the dialogue. And I was like, what does that mean? But you can actually see where he's cut the lines and rearranged them in order to fit the new 8 pages. Like they didn't go back to they didn't re-letter it, which is an important point too, is that all the EC comics were lettered first. Yeah. Which is not normally what happens is you write a script, the artist draws it, and then you come back and you put the balloons where they'll fit. No, EC put everything on the pages first, and then the artist had to draw what was there. The other thing I would say about it is that even though it's kind of the same thing, something happens, there's a twist, often it's about how much the artist can gross you out before you get to the final gross out.
Yeah.
And I think they are totally successful on that level. I don't think they are. Yes, they're pulpy, and yes, they're 50s writing, but I feel like I read half these stories a year ago when I read that giant Dark Horse collection, and I was still like, I don't quite remember how this one ends, and I was like, and I'm reading it, and I was like, oh, I forgot how gross this is. And Graham Ingels especially is the guy who has kind of the least attractive art style, let's say. His figures are so gross and weird and hunched over, and there's so much black. There's more black than white in every panel, and it doesn't. This one with the teddy bear called Shoe Button Eyes is so stupid, but it's relentless. It's like, oh, we're going to make this as gross as possible. It doesn't matter how stupid it is, and Graham Ingels is going to draw it in the most repulsive way you can imagine, and everybody's cramped in, and there's this, I'm looking at the last page, this little kid's twisted body in the middle of the page, and it's like, and then you get this dead man with somehow the teddy bear's eyes have ended up where his eyes should be because it's ripped out his eyes, and all of this kind of stuff, and it's all very typical EC stuff, but every artist is like, yeah, how can I top what this other artist did, or how can I top what I did last month?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is that you have to, I think you have to read this stuff for the art. It's totally the art. It's like,
yes,
the writing is just serviceable if you're lucky, and the stories are, some of the stories, like, there's good source material, right? Like a lot of Ray Bradbury stuff, and I think some of the ideas too, like again, Master Race, that's pretty interesting. There's even some stuff where it's a little bit exploitative, but or a little bit, it's probably extremely exploitative. But some of the things like this, I think it's the second story with the woman who got some kind of psychosis, and
it's another Johnny Craig story.
It's a really horrifying portrayal of a mental ill, a psychosis, specifically, or some number of psychoses. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know, but yeah, here's this woman whose experience of reality is twisted and terrifying for her. So yeah, there are some pretty heady ideas, but it's in terms of the pattern, it's just that again and again, it's like, yep, this is a horrifying idea. Here's your twist.
Okay, I will say that so almost all the stories were written by Al Feldstein and Bill Gaines.
Yeah.
Mostly by Al Feldstein. I think almost everyone. I will say that the odd man out is Harvey Kurtzman, who's another cartooning genius. Now, he had control of the war books himself, and he actually hated the horror books. He thought the horror books were going too far, but they gave him control of the war books, and he's like, I'm going to hand letter these. So they were hand lettered. They weren't. They didn't use the Leroy lettering, which is the mechanical lettering set that they use in every other EC story. So they have a more organic feel to them in general. And I will say that those are more like harrowing anti-war stories.
Corpse on the Imjin. That was one. Now that you mention it, quite a leak. Anti-war.
And we did a whole episode on some of the war comics, probably 10 years ago or more. But the thing that kind of strikes me about, I think Kurtzman and Krigstein are artistes. I think they're real. I think they're different from the other guys who were, let's see how fun we can make this, and let's see how extreme we can make this. And Jack Davis was given some of the most extreme scripts to draw. They seem to know, okay, here's this baseball one where they rip out this guy's guts, and they use his heart as like home plate, and they're using his intestines like as the lines between the bases. Oh, like the most. Yeah. And they're like, okay, Jack Davis, you can draw this. And those guys were like, okay, they seem to be like happily drawing it. And Kurtzman was like, what are you guys doing? This is awful. And he was off in his own corner doing these war comics. But I think his level of cartooning, Kurtzman and Krigstein, I think were on a kind of a completely different level, I think, from the others. As much as I love those guys, they're all like top 5. I think Krigstein, Kurtzman are maybe like in the top 1 and 2. I think they're not even in comics. They're doing something else.
Yeah. That's a fair. I think that's a pretty good point. I can definitely get behind that one. They're on another level. Although I didn't really get the flying machine. Maybe more.
It's weird ass Ray Bradbury story.
I mean, beautiful portrayal of it for sure. But
and Bradbury loved it. He wrote a letter in, like that was in the comics in the next issue. He's like, this is really great. But it's another Krigstein one, The Flying Machine. It's like set in ancient China, and this guy develops like a hang glider, and the emperor is like, I got to kill you in case other people get interested in hang gliders and decide to invade me. But he's built his own little miniature world, this automaton thing.
Yeah, I really got the sense that the emperor was afraid that this peasant's invention was going to overshadow his.
Yeah.
And so that's why he killed him. So that, I mean, and maybe that's the horror sci-fi influence of the context here. It was just like, cause it's got to be some twisted, like, serial killer horror reason. But yeah, I don't know. It was, but it's quite neat because, Krigstein has a very different, much of a less realistic style from so many of the other artists. Like even the guys who are doing the horror stuff, I mean, part of what makes it so great and gory and shocking is that their detail is so realistic. I mean, they're figured. Realistic is not the right word, but detailed and semi-realistic.
It's a world. You're in that world.
Yeah. I mean, all the Jack women Davis, are perfect hourglasses and all that. So I don't know about realistic, but it's high fidelity, I guess. And then you come to The Flying Machine, which is the first Krigstein story that you come to in this book, and you turn the page and see it, and it's like, whoa, this is a totally different thing. It's kind of neat too because it's really yellow. The pages are really yellow, so it's set aside in that way as well. But it's because you go, who is it that's just before him? Oh, that's the Roy Krenkel story. Time to Leave. Very realistic style.
Coming up, is EC's science fiction work inferior to the publisher's other genres? how do the 1950s social justice stories read today, and more. But first, a reminder to join us for 20th century TV and music trivia quiz videos and more on our Patreon page. Every month, patrons donating $4 a month or more also get a full-length podcast episode reviewing an issue of The Amazing Spider-Man by Lee and Ditko and now Lee and Romita. Check out our goals and rewards at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
Greetings from Wayne Manor Memoirs, a podcast dedicated to exploring the Batman mythos.
Each episode, we research a character, story, contributor, or piece of pop culture related or adjacent to the Dark Knight,
and try to understand why these topics are important to the Bat mythos. I'm Joe.
I'm Kendall, and some of our favorite topics include the transformation of Mr. Zero into Mr. Freeze,
The early appearances of the Riddler,
Booster Gold,
Commandi,
Jim Aparo,
and many, many more. Check out Wayne Manor Memoirs every other Friday, wherever you download your podcasts.
and follow us at Wayne Manor Memoirs on Facebook or at W Memoirs on Twitter.
Until next time, Bat Fanatics, be brave.
And stay bold.
Yeah, and Crickle's kind of a journeyman. Like he's one of the names that I almost never think of when I think of EC. I don't know how many he actually did for them. I mean, it is a highly detailed story, but like then when you get to the Al Williamson science fiction stories at the back, and they're like, oh my god. And I'm just jumping around here like crazy, but 50 Girls 50.
Yeah.
I mean, because this is a crazy ass science fiction story. It's notorious, I think. And
this
it's
one
really
reminded me of Passengers with Chris.
I've heard people say that. People said when Passengers came out, they said, "Is this 50 Girls 50?" when they saw the trailer for it.
And unfortunately, it's not. But
no.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting one because the other EC science fiction stories are, I think the horror stories and the shock stories and the did I say the war crime and horror stories are great. Like those are great EC stories. I think the science fiction stuff was always weaker. Like there's a story by George, beautifully drawn by Al Williamson, about this alien that arrives on Earth back in the ancient past, and these knights kill it. And it's like this really funny story. Like the alien is like this little kid that's trying to get home. He's like, hey, I wish my dad was here, kind of stuff. And it's really this weird, it's got this human edge. They keep bringing him women as sacrifices. And he's like, oh, they brought me this woman. Please go away. I want to go home or whatever. And then at the end, it's revealed, dun, dun, dun. That was St. George who slew that dragon. The alien was the dragon. And it's like, this is the dumbest twist ending.
Yeah.
And there's this other one, Food for Thought, where they they land on this planet, which 50,000 years ago, the humans planted. They put plants on the planet.
Yeah.
Or they seeded the planet.
Dead world.
And then they come back 50,000 years later. They're like, okay, is there intelligent life so we can we want to colonize this place? Is there intelligent life?
It made no sense at all.
No, there's no intelligent life. They're like, well, it's just plants. Let's firebomb the planet and start again.
There's no intelligent life here. I guess we can't live here.
We can't colonize it. I guess by colonize they meant enslave. I don't know. It was really a weird. But 50 Girls 50
logic.
is it's like one of the crime comics because it's got perverts and people stabbing each other in the back. And this guy's like, yeah, I'm going to have sex with 50 women over 50 years. I'm going to screw all these women.
I love that it's like he's committing slow suicide in order to just
to get laid. I'm going to have sex with 50 women.
Have my choice of women for
I'll be
the rest
78
of my life.
years old. I'm going to unfreeze this 20-year-old woman.
Yeah.
We'll make out for a year, and then I'll unfreeze the next one. God, I love this story to death because it's just so perverse and weird. It is not like the other EC science fiction comics, I will say. The other science fiction comic that we really should probably talk about, although we talked about it a few months ago on this very same podcast, is Judgment Day. Which had a really, I want to say the effect was more interesting in black and white because this Earthman arrives on this planet, which again has been seeded by Earth or created by Earth, and it's populated by robots, red robots and blue robots. And he's there to judge whether this planet, which they created, is ready to join the Galactic Union or whatever they call it. Yep. And then he finds out that the red robots are prejudiced against the blue robots for no reason, even though their guts are the same. They're built in a different part of town, and they have to sit at the back of the bus, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like it adds a dimension to it being in black and white, because you don't even see the red and blue of the robots. Yeah. Which I kind of dug.
Orange and blue.
But this was one of the, there was, in that series, Shock Suspense Stories, there was usually, now we talked about this when we did, I think it was one, social justice story per issue. Out of the 4 stories you get in that issue, one would be, actually this one didn't run in Shock, but there's 2 that did. Ingratitude, about the soldier that returns home and his buddy's body has not been buried the way he wanted it to be. Yeah. And I believe the one where the girl was raped, and A Kind of Justice, which is in there pretty early on.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the 50s-ish of the stories. How did you feel about the social justice stories like Judgment Day and A Kind of Justice? And
well, I thought I like to see them because despite my criticisms, I think my overall feeling towards this book is one of fondness.
Right.
And I definitely like to see those social justice elements come down on what I would consider to be the right side of the coin.
Right.
Not the political right, the correct side of the coin.
The right side of history, I guess you could say.
Yeah. It's like racism is bad. You shouldn't discriminate against people because they have different color skin. And, raping and lying about it is not good either.
Yeah.
And I think that's great that was the stance that the company ostensibly held, or at least that's what they were publishing.
Yeah.
And I made a little note to myself. I wanted to bring it up. I thought it was kind of funny because in my memory, and correct me if I'm wrong, EC, at least a lot of the content that EC published, was kind of part of the reason that the Comics Code got created.
That's right.
And yeah, there's just a bunch of really good moral stories. And obviously, this is 27 of them. And there was a lot more stuff that they published. But
yeah, they were. So the introduction of the Comics Code, there was a sort of Comics Code in place before, and EC claimed to be following it. But then when these, what's the name of that guy? I can't believe I'm blanking on this. But anyway, so the parents groups and everything came down hard on the horror comics. And they were all trying to match EC. They were all having decapitations and all sorts of crazy stuff happening in them. And there were some deliberate misreadings of stories. Some of the racial stories. They were like, this is a racist story. They were, you know what I mean? It's like what's happening now. Look at this racist story about
Master Race, depicting Jews as vengeful murderers or something.
Not even
No.
I think they might have even used the N-word in a story. I don't know if I'm misremembering this, but they were this is a racist comic. This,
right.
Or, A Kind of Justice being, they might accuse that of being a pro-rape story or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's that,
well, but I think there's a certain element of people who are probably, on their face, they're anti-censorship, but actually they don't want people to talk about things that make them uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
So yeah, they don't want there to be any depictions of race in comics.
Right.
And by that they mean everybody should be white.
Right. Right. So I would say a Master Race would kind of include in the social justice category as well, but only because at the time nobody was talking about the Holocaust. By 55, it was still hush-hush kind of thing. It happened, and the people who were there were like, I can't talk about it. And it was kind of a shocking thing. And I mean, these are all Jewish creators.
But this must have been a challenging story.
Oh, yeah.
Like, to publish it, like, okay, and then to read it as a young person in the 50s. Yeah.
Well, I think all of them were really, and you'd see the letters in that book, EC Comics. What was the title of it that we reviewed a few months ago by Kiana Whitted? She talks about all the letters that would come in, and they were like angry letters from like racists. Basically, they were like, "Yeah, you try sitting next to a black person on the bus, you won't like it. Trust me." You know, that kind of letters they'd be getting, and I can't believe you printed this story. That kind of stuff. Yeah. So one of the shocking things, I hadn't read A Kind of Justice before, which is the one with the girl who gets raped. And then we have a shock twist of who the rapist was at the end. But when you open up this book, so I hadn't read it before. You open up this book and they've got this 2-page spread, which is the opening panel splash from that. And this is the first thing I looked at. And I was like, oh my God, this book is going to be so goddamn awesome, because look at the feathering and shading and the inking and every line of the floorboards has been drawn. I was like, oh my God, this is going to be the greatest book. And then you get to the story and you realize what this is actually depicting.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, and we talked about this when we talked about the frontline combat stories on this podcast 10 years ago or whatever it was. Yeah. There was some filmmaker who said that it's impossible to make an anti-war movie because as soon as you put it on film, you glamorize the violence. And I kind of feel like sometimes that's true and sometimes not. And it's true with comics, especially because the better the artist is, the more you notice how awesome the drawing is of this horrible thing that's happened. Yeah. So I kind of felt like maybe that was one of the problems with the social justice stories, to a little bit, like they're too good, I guess is what I'm trying to accuse them of.
I mentioned like there's something exploitative about it, and I think that this is one of those stories where it almost feels like they're. I didn't think it was that bad. I actually felt that this story weirdly had a bit of, I mean, it was clearly sympathetic to the girl.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
Right? Which was kind of its saving grace, but at the same time, it was still kind of like we're exploiting this kind of horrible thing for what is really entertainment, right? Like it's got that twist. It's like a ooh shocker kind of comic book, right? And that's kind of where it's a little bit troubling. But I mean, again, whatever.
I agree, but I think it's I think we're kind of at the edges of why the Comics Code came after EC, why the parents came after EC, because this story especially, and a lot of the social justice stories are like, and EC and Mad Magazine up through the 80s. Don't trust your parents, don't trust authorities. These people are lying to you about all sorts of shit. They're saying the world has to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. Yeah. And just because this guy is a sheriff of a town, that doesn't mean anything. Don't believe it. And that's the thing. I think it's it's kind of a sleazy story, especially the twist. The twist I think is kind of sleazy, but at the same time, I felt like this is actually the kind of thing I like. I like the questioning of authority that is in a lot of the EC stories, and especially the social justice stories. And Judgment Day is a really interesting one because my understanding is it was printed twice, so it was published once, and then later the Comics Code was formed, and then they decided to reprint it, and the Comics Code rejected it. And they were like, why? And then they said, you got to remove the sweat from the guy's forehead in the last panel. This was their objection. It was... It's a real famous moment in comics history, and Bill Gaines just literally said, according to every interview, said "fuck you" to the Comics Code guy and hung up the phone on him. And they ran the story with the beads of sweat on his forehead, which, according to the line of dialogue, are reflecting the stars of the universe, like his. Right. This universe is represented in his face. So that, I think, really speaks to what you were saying about they just didn't want to see stories with black people in them. How can we get rid of this completely? Let's keep just, thumbing the screws into whatever angle we can, just make up excuses to ban this story or to refuse this story seeing print.
Which is, it's something that we're seeing now. It's funny. In America, there's all these stories about the banning of books and things like that. Mouse, it's kind of a connection. That article you sent me, I noticed, was partly an analysis that Art Spiegelman did of Art Spiegelman and two other people. Master Race. And Mouse is, recently being considered, or maybe it was banned or whatever, for nudity and bad language.
Yeah, nudity, literally concentration camp corpses.
Yeah.
Of mice. Drawings of mice, nude, dead mice.
Yeah. I'm sure this conversation doesn't need to be had again, but probably one of the more important books your library is potentially going to have does not need to be banned because it's uncomfortable. And I think that's probably what happened with a lot of stuff too. But at the same time, I think for the audience in 2022, if you're not kind of going into this book recognizing that this is something from the 50s, you could definitely be turned off by a lot of this stuff. And I'd necessarily be wrong to be, but at the same time, I think recognizing that it does come from a time and that really the positions of the writers and the artists and stuff do seem to be, like I said, they're kind of on the right side of history, even if the way women are portrayed. Wally's World, or My World, I guess.
My World, yes. The Wally Wood.
What does he say?
That's the most backwards one of them all, yes.
Yeah. So this is my world. It is a world of lonely women who turn their eyes to the heavens and watch for the moving flame among the stars that signifies the return of their spacemen.
Yes, and there are those Wally Wood women with the perfect tits and the legs and the they're just these idealized, and the way he shades everyone. That's kind of the most backwards of them. Yet it's the most beautifully drawn. Look at every panel of the story, and you're like, oh my god, I can't believe it.
It's just as a guy talking about how he uses his imagination to make a living. So it's awesome. But you're kind of like, this was a 1950s dude.
Yeah, really couldn't think ahead in that respect. Yeah,
not in that respect. Yeah.
Oh, another story that surprised me kind of at the end was the one. It was the one with the dogs. So there's this prison, and it's got two fences, an inner fence and an outside fence.
Yeah.
And it's a Reed Crandall story called Dog Food. Now, the story is called Dog Food, and it's about these killer dogs that will kill any prisoners that manage to get past the first fence. And I'm like, okay, I know what's going to happen. The cruel prison warden is going to be eaten by the dogs at the end. Right, that is not what happens.
That's not what happens.
There's a great twist ending. Really gross, great twist ending that I was shocked by. Because I hadn't read this one before. But I will say that turning the light on in the last panel is a shock that happens in at least two other EC stories that I know of. And often the line is, and then some idiot turned on the lights, is sometimes the last line of the story. Right. And you don't get to see what it is, but it's you can guess. But that had kind of a great twist.
See it there.
Yeah.
I did like some of the ones that were a little bit more just full-on humorous. Not so much the baseball one, but country clubbing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
it was almost like a Dr. Seuss kind of writing to it, where this guy is being chased through the bayou by this monstrous mutated hillbilly or something, whatever. I think the guy was an escaped convict or something and broke into Buddy's house and ended up killing his mother or something, and then gets chased by him, and then the whole thing is it's oh, you dropped your club, mister.
The club he used to kill his mother, he returns it to him. That's the reason he's been chasing him. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, those were kind of fun.
The Alex Toth one, Thunderjet, is a really great one art-wise too. It's got a lot of silent panels in it, which is surprising for comics at the time. But sometimes there's 4 panels in a row of just silent, just jets fighting each other. and it really moves at a clip. And I know that Kurtzman was really obsessed with the war comics to get every detail right. So they would actually go to bases and look at the jets and talk to the pilots and all that kind of stuff and get everything as accurate as possible. And it's really done in that amazing, Totho's such a great artist. He drew a lot of crap comics over his career because he was morally like offended by a lot of stuff. So he ended up drawing like Hot Wheels comics and shit. But this is a great little 8-pager, I think. It's not really about anything except how dangerous it is to fly and what it must be like to be a fighter pilot.
Yeah, it's a little bit cliche that like just way that the pilot is, pretty square-jawed.
Yes, that's
John
true.
Wayne kind of
cowboy
of the sky.
Yeah.
But again, that's a little bit of that 50s-ish stuff coming out. But yeah, not bad.
Yeah, and Master Race, which is my God, what a standout.
Yeah.
Oh, I will say there is one thing too about the colors. So they talked in the interview. There was one panel where you could see a worker's suspenders, and Mary Severin had colored them the same color as the shirt, so they were kind of lost.
Yeah.
And that annoyed Krigstein because it was like an important detail of this working class guy. Maybe I'll post a link to the article that was written by Kurtzman et al. Because there's so much detail, and every panel of Master Race is so perfectly thought out and constructed that we could do a whole episode on it. But we'd just be repeating what they said about everything from the body language, the folding and the folds and clothing, the blacks and whites, the shapes of the panels. Every last thing was considered for maximum effect.
Yeah, and that analysis there is definitely as interesting as the comic itself.
Yeah, it was in Squa Tront came out in the mid-70s. But I will say the Master Race, the thing I want to talk about really is the shocking part is always to me the panel of the subway train pulling in, because he's done something that I have not seen before or since in comics, which is the train is pulling in, and the way he's drawn it is you get the man standing next to the train, and the image of the people in the train is repeated like 5 times to show that it's going past. So he hasn't drawn 5 panels where each time it's a little bit further past. He's drawn 1 panel, and it's almost like a mirror effect of some sort, where it's like a House of Mirrors effect, where you see it rushing by, and then the next panel you see there's only 2 repeats, so you can tell the train has slowed, which to me is mind-blowing. But it's really mind-blowing at the end when Reisman gets run over by the train, because you see the 5 or 6 repetitions again, and you understand how fast the train is moving.
Yeah.
Because of how he did it the first time.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, when he does cut things up into panels, like right above that, when Reisman is falling onto the tracks, another super famous sequence, it's like cutting it into 4 panels of one guy falling, which is like a split-second thing.
Yeah.
Almost slows it right down. So
yeah, and you see how he's cut like a different expression in each moment there as he's falling, and anyone who's kind of fallen, stepped backwards off of a sidewalk curb or whatever, knows that you go through those 3 or 4 different moments of like surprise, and then like trying to catch yourself, and then really trying to catch yourself, and then no, I'm down.
Yeah.
He doesn't just fall down here, but there is so much that is mind blowing in that kind. Just on those, I think it's on that same page where they talk about it in that article about how the pant legs are like the folds. I think you mentioned the folds of the pant legs they're showing us that he's wobbly,
you can tell how he doesn't have a firm foothold based on how,
Actually, I guess it's maybe the previous page where he's starting to run away from the guy.
Yes, that too, yeah.
Yeah, he's kind of...
Yeah, okay, so... Wow, so I guess we're saying it's awesome, but you have to know it's from the 50s. I guess is that the last word? But I think it's pretty obvious it's from the 50s, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that's
I don't think anybody's going to
be used for anybody.
Used.
Like, I'm probably an outlier in the sense of being someone who's never read any EC and is going to run out and spend like $50 on this book, or what? I mean, it's not $50, $39.99 US. $53.99 Canadian. So yeah, it's probably a bit weird for someone who's never read any EC to spend their money on an Artisan edition collection. But but for me, true. That's kind of it's interesting because I'm and for anybody coming to this, even though I'm not familiar with the content in detail, as a comics reader, I'm absolutely aware of the historical place that EC has in comics. Seen interviews read interviews with Bill Gaines. So yeah, that's definitely, that would not be news to anybody that this is from the 50s. So it's probably not a lot of non-EC fans coming to this book.
Yeah, I think I would say if you're interested in original comics art, it's indispensable because it's affordable and it's a size that will actually fit on your shelf. Unlike the Artisan, which has to sit on the floor behind me. It's actually totally worth seeing in that respect. You don't even have to read the stories. You can just look at the pictures. It is really in another universe. I would say if you had no background with EC, maybe the Choke Gasp collection from Dark Horse might be a good starting point, but that's quite expensive and fat. It's like 600 pages. So, but I will say the Fantagraphics editions, which are in black and white, are organized by artist. So if there's a particular artist you like if you just like John Severin, you could just buy the John Severin book and get all those stories. Or if you just liked Wally Wood or something like that, or Graham Ingels, you could just get that. Just get those volumes. Specifically, they're in black and white. I think there are hardcovers. But good luck finding out what versions any of these are. I think you have to physically hold them.
Yeah.
Because all this information is very vague online to try to figure out what's going on with these books, as we talked about at the beginning. Any final thoughts?
No, that's it. It's a nice book. And affordable for sure. And interesting... Interesting, as you said, if for nothing else.
Yep.
Beautiful, uncolored, untouched art.
The Best of EC Stories Artisan Edition is published by IDW. You can help the Deconstructing Comics family of podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read it and record our critique. Next week, as I prepare to finally move out of my cough-inducing apartment, we present another vintage edition of our Patreon show, Tim Catches Up with the MCU, in which Mulele and I discuss 2016's Doctor Strange. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.